aspect of your empire, and that is the kind of Serpentine is perhaps in terms of the relationship between aura and footprint, the kind of most efficient artistic institution in the world. I don't know a single institution that per square meter achieves as much, creates such an incredible reputation, performs that much, etc., etc. So I think that is in itself an achievement, and an enormous achievement, I think, particularly in a kind of environment and a moment where all museums are expanding, have been expanding, and I think your strategy to expand but also to destroy and take back the expansion kind of every year is really incredibly smart. Yet you have expansionist plans, and I would like you to kind of talk about that.
Thank you. Rem, thank you for being so generous. And also, can I salute you both at this point of the marathon and say what an incredible achievement this is, and also to be seated in this wonderful structure.
Well,
I mean, I think the thing that's incredibly interesting about the Serpentine is really what we can do and the way that we can be like a lung. You know, we inhale and we exhale so that we can do things like this, which is part of an expanded program. But I suppose the thing is about an institution of this scale, which is so really modest, the size of a house, is that all territory which is gained is already a huge advantage. And also, I suppose I would go on to say that the expectations are low. So, because scale usually equals rather modest ambition. And so with that in mind, it's interesting to see where the gains can be.
Where the gains can be?
Gains can be. Gains of territory, gains of practice, gains of skill, gains of experience, gains of audience, and so on. And it feels a bit like, I mean, I talk quite a lot about hand-to-hand combat, because it feels really like being at the very sharp end of a sort of development of artistic and architectural design practice, and also the forcing of the public programs of which this is part. And bearing in mind, and now really embracing, relishing and enjoying the fact that we are small. I used to feel very embarrassed about anybody who said we are small. I used to really almost shudder, because in comparison to our larger institutions like Tate and Museum of Modern Art New York, it felt sort of slightly humiliating. Now I think it's the most glorious thing, because it gives us freedom. And the freedom is to take as a backbone this place, the place of the Serpentine Gallery, of the building, of the exhibition program, which has been going since 1970, and then to expand it in a way that we want. So the fact that we can have your pavilion, your and Cecil's pavilion here for 3 months, and then it goes. And that when the pavilion, for example, goes, we have a piece of lawn which is almost so incredibly small you can't imagine that anything could possibly be there in the first place. And then, in case people forget, it comes back next year by another architect. But in terms of a global ambition, since it's really also interesting not to think in a small way, but a rather large way. That's why Hans-Ulrich is here. And what's so interesting is that the Smithson interview that was played just before this session was unbelievably fortuitous in terms of just my own personal memory, because the plans that Hans-Ulrich and I hatched actually was as a result of me first seeing that interview at the Courtauld. And a very chance remark, as we shared a taxi back to Hans-Ulrich's hotel before I went on afterwards, which was a joke, a shared joke about doing something in London that we both agreed would be professional suicide. And from that unbelievably sort of minor comment, this whole landscape unfolded about what could a public institution really contribute in a meaningful way at this point in time. What could it contribute to this situation, the situation of the UK, but also globally. And so we worked on a rather wonderful matrix of ideas, a layering ideas that embrace the global in the most ambitious way, as well as the local. And so thinking of it is like is a column, and from the column things expand outwards. So it's a very long answer, but it's a sort of intriguing one, and clearly maybe the length of my answer shows the degree to which it still intrigues me. And of course it's very nice to have Hans-Ulrich here, I should say.
But can you be a little bit more specific maybe? Because I think maybe I can reveal without revealing any secrets that even the Serpentine has mentioned the word brand, or applied the word brand to itself. So what would you say are the potential consequences of that?
Well, I mean, to be really honest with you, the first time I thought about, or really dared to think about the Serpentine as a brand, when it was actually you used it in the room upstairs in my office when we were just beginning to work together. And I thought, hey, that's something that we can embrace. If Rem says we're a brand, then that sounds good to me. And it became a sort of ownership thing, because a brand it sort of assumes, for me at least, influence and a certain degree of power outside the specialism that the organization may be known for, so a much wider context. And the brand that we are now exploring in a very real way is what would happen if we branched out not only in Western culture, but Eastern culture, absolutely outside our terrain, both digitally and in reality. But not, I should say, setting up, institutions that would necessarily we would be, running elsewhere. But it's absolutely, as one of our very distinguished Chinese colleagues said recently, one gallery, one world. And he said that as a result of my explaining what we are planning to do. So if I'm already being too oblique, I shall try again to be more precise. But I think I can say that the agency of the Unrealized Projects was launched very soon after Hans-Ulrich arrived here, which is a sort of conceptual program that may be realized in future. Artists' visions, architects' visions, designers' visions that we may indeed realize, but a sort of document of these incredible endeavors. So from things like this to, I think it's also, exploring art from art, architecture, design, and expanding our programs to include these disciplines from other cultures that we haven't explored before. Is that an answer, or can I continue?
Yeah, and it actually leads to something which I thought could be interesting in terms of, obviously, your permanent kind of reinvention of the Serpentine started a long time ago, and I think one of the things Eric Hobsbawm recommended in terms of his protest against forgetting is that we address memory in this marathon. And I was wondering very much somehow who in the English art world, in terms of museum pioneers, have been your models, kind of when you started to think about art institutions, who have been kind of like, who would be analog to somebody like Peter Smithson or Cedric Price in architecture for you in terms of the museum, because that is maybe the field where there is the biggest amnesia, kind of museum pioneers. People have somehow invented sort of curatorial models. America, there's Walter Hobbs, there's Pontus Hultén. So I was wondering about the UK, and London particularly, who were somehow these figures.
Well, when I started here in '91, I mean, obviously the landscape was hugely different from the one it is now. It was really a sort of poverty, in a way, that reflected perhaps the culture of London. And I mean, you were saying earlier, everybody's talking about London in quite a romantic way. And I think, thinking about that comment, which is true, it's possibly because, certainly from my perspective, it is unbelievably astounding that London now, in 2006, can be a world player, certainly in the arts. And it's the only thing that I feel really patriotic about, not about British art necessarily, about the arts in general terms having a really strong, unbelievably important place within this culture, and for that to be recognized abroad. So this really seismic shift unbelievably seismic shift is almost incomprehensible, which is why it's a long introduction to my answer, because when I came here to be director, the director that I most admired was Nick Serota when he was at the Whitechapel. And the reason for that was because he did the most extraordinary range of shows of artists that had not been shown here, that there was a corner particularly of the London art world that was really doing remarkable work that was at the same level to our institutional counterparts anywhere else. And that was very, very unusual because the culture, the sort of, not only the public at large, but also the art world were very relatively enclosed. So this extraordinary flowering that is been well documented and well known is a reflection of the city, and the city is a reflection of it.
You mentioned another pioneer who somehow is very forgotten out of UK, I think called Joanna Drew. Could you talk about her?
Well, in quite a sort of romantic way, I have two art world parents. One is David Sylvester and the other is Joanna Drew. For two reasons, because they both were my mentors when I came into the museum profession after being an artist for many, many years. And I was not very skilled in to do the job as it then developed. And Joanna was head of the Arts Council. And what's so very touching is that Richard Wentworth, who of course was part of this interviewing process, sends me postcards about her all the time. She's very present in his thinking because she was such a remarkable woman. Remarkable because she started as an artist. Her mother, well actually she was a dancer, her mother was an artist. And she ran this extraordinary, in one way, empire, you could say. She was Director of Arts at the Arts Council, which included the Hayward, the Arts Council collection. It was a huge empire. And also she was responsible for bringing into the profession Nick Serota, for example, David Elliott, and many, 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 many others who went on, Catherine Lambert, who ran the Whitechapel, Susan Braids, who ran the Hayward. So this sort of, these children, so to speak, who then went on to play such an important part in institutional life here. And then David Sylvester was at that time an advisor to the Hayward, and I worked with him. He was very, very significant. And indeed, as you know, again from one of the earlier speakers, Ken Adam, it was the last show that David worked on at my invitation to do something here. And just as a very funny anecdote that amused me hugely was when David was so ill, and because we worked together for such a long time, I wanted to work with him again, and also it was very important for him to continue to be practicing as a critic, as a writer, as a curator. So I said to him if he had the opportunity, what show could he possibly imagine might take place at the Serpentine? And for those of you who knew him, he was very lugubrious, and there were very long silences, always in telephone calls, so you thought you'd been cut off. So there was a very, very long silence, and he said he wanted to think about it, and he rang me back the next day, and he said, I want to do a show of Ken Adam. I thought, who is he? This is absolutely awful. I don't know who he is. I can't show my ignorance. So I played for time. And then I asked my friends, and nobody could help me. And then it turned out that the epiphany came with Larry Gagosian and Lynn Cook in the Serpentine. They come to see one of the shows we'd done. And the Ken Adam show was born. And it was a great pleasure to work with both of them. And you know, David, as Ken told you, died shortly after his last interview with him.
I have a kind of a question. You call the Serpentine a public institution. How does that work, and how public is it? Because I don't have the feeling that you have a kind of lavish kind of subsidy that guarantees your survival at infinitum. And how does that fact of being public position you in terms of private enterprises of a comparable, if not larger scale, that are proliferating? such as the white cube, and how embattled do you feel vis-à-vis the explosion of the private?
I think people are broadly divided into two categories, although I think possibly I span the two. And indeed, the Serpentine may to a certain degree. If you are in the public sector, not for profit, the audience is a key part of what you do. It's important. I mean, personally, it matters to me how many people come to see Serpentine shows, or visit the Pavilion, or participate in our public programs, or anything else we do. In that sense, size absolutely matters to me, because it's an incredible effort to do what we do. I mean, not only for me, but the whole team. And so if you make a big effort to have 1.5 people, which used to be the case, to see exhibitions, and also there was something rather noble, even, about only 1.5 people coming to see exhibitions, because it was generally considered to be that those 1.5 people were of such supreme intellect and understanding that only they could really understand what they were seeing. Well, from my perspective, that's okay, but I'd rather have, 150,000 people working on the assumption that maybe not 1.5, but maybe 50.5 will have a life-changing experience. So, running hand in hand with that, there is also this strange business of being very poorly subsidized, for all our dear colleagues here from the Arts Council and elsewhere, please note. And then what do you do with the fact that actually you don't have enough money to do anything? And that in itself becomes a rather interesting question. What can you do if you have nothing? And in a way, that's how the Pavilion, well, there are many reasons, and not financial, or indeed to do with generating visitors. Why the Pavilion program was born and becomes so interesting is, how can you commission really great architects to design something if you have no budget at all? Well, of course, a huge amount of goodwill and many, many, many things. But the principle is, if you have no money, you can't do things. And so from the Serpentine's perspective, possibly, if you have no money, let's see what, in fact, you can do. And then that becomes interesting as an idea. That being said, of course, we need to be quite, well, even very creative about how we get all that to work. And that's part of the interest, and also sometimes part of the frustration. And the idea, of course, the public sector, the private sector now, the commercial sector, I mean, it goes back to the size thing. I mean, in terms of institutionally, we will soon be smaller, probably, I mean, I'm being extreme, than all our colleagues in the commercial sector, who are building bigger and bigger edifices, producing bigger and bigger catalogues, and so on. So that then gets back to the question, which is what Hans-Ulrich and I are working on, together with the team here. How then can you be relevant when the power, in one sense, has really shifted so radically? And this is really, for us, a very considerable question, and one which, I mean, is the most pressing question of the day for not-for-profits, in my view.
I was wondering what would be your kind of dream institution for the 21st century, if you have any kind of vision or imagination of how for you the kind of institution, public institution you imagine it would sort of work?
Well, I think it's very interesting because, I mean, it's no accident that Frieze, the exhibition Frieze, was the result of the most extraordinary rebellion, you could say, anarchy, against a situation that really didn't support that generation of artists coming out of art school. And the most important lesson I ever learned of my professional career was if the situation doesn't work for you, invent your own. So it was force of circumstances of this particular situation in this country, in my view, that resulted in this incredible creativity, invention, and real flowering of contemporary art, contemporary British art. So there is, I think, in a sort of slightly, well, incredibly masochistic way, a great deal to be said of that, if you like, creative tension. But there is also a point whereby it just gets unbelievably reductive and therefore unhelpful. And so that balance, I think, is a very fine one, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.